Hello, and welcome to IAB Pulse, our regular video news show where we discuss the hottest and most important topics in the digital advertising industry today. I'm your host, Chris Brutally, IAB's Vice President of Industry Insights and Content Strategy. As we embark on 2024, there's no better time than now to talk about the year ahead in terms of ad spend and ad revenue. And there's no one better to talk about this topic with industry thought leader Brian Wieser. Brian is the principal of Madison and Wall and is previously known for his work at Group M, Pivotal Research, and Magna, among others. Brian, welcome to the virtual stage, my friend.
Thanks for having me here, Chris.
We are very happy to have you. I want to get right into it. There's a lot to talk about. And of course, as usual, we don't have a ton of time. So the first thing is that IAB and yourself and the four major agencies that make projections regarding ad rev and spend, being Dentsu, Group M, Magna, and Zenith, all projected high single-digit growth year over year in 2024 versus 2023. So we're looking at a nice, not a bad year, a nice year. What's interesting, though, is that our Outlook report revealed a 20% decrease year over year in the percentage of buyers at brands and agencies saying that they are concerned about the economy in the US and its effect on their spend. So if we put all these things together, if we kind of connect these dots, it seems to me like the mood has changed. My question for you is, would you agree that the mood has changed a little bit over the last year? And if so, what do you think is driving that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the industry was incorrectly negative about the state of the economy. I think that perceptions of the advertising market as well were just wildly off, underappreciating some of the moving parts and the dynamics of the ad market. And to some degree, around this time last year, the industry talked itself into not a downturn, a meaningful deceleration, I think, at least in the US, where I calculated that for the fourth quarter of last year, growth rate was basically flat year over year. Now, even that doesn't properly do justice to the actual reality of the ad business, because 4Q22 was lapping a 4Q21, which was, like the rest of 2021, ludicrously and unsustainably strong. I don't think anyone should have been counting on the sustainability of crypto or rapid delivery categories, among others. And so if you look through that a year ago, even, you'd say, well, actually, in terms of the businesses that are going concerns, things are actually okay. And it's true enough, the economy itself was pretty solid. Yeah, inflation was high. Yeah, interest rates were going up. But it doesn't follow necessarily that there would be an economic downturn. I understand why people believe that was a possibility or a probability in many cases, but the reality is that consumers continue to have a ton of cash handy. Unemployment for people across the board was going down, especially for lower income people, where maybe more of the income they would generate would get spent on things, and that advertising would actually be more impactful. But the biggest thing that was probably impacting the ad market even then, that was maybe not appreciated, and hopefully by now a little more appreciated, cross-border advertising coming into the United States and helping to fuel a lot of the growth that we're seeing. That's mostly Chinese manufacturers spending money on American environments, or in American environments on global platforms or US ones. And so, yeah, I think that as people see that, they can see the growth is good. However, the one thing I'd add to the vibe point you're making is that I think if you were to talk to let's say a seller of TV advertising, they may not fully agree that things are positive. And I think if you were to talk to an independent publisher who isn't a platform with massive scale, with billions of dollars of revenues, they might also beg to differ. So it's not an evenly distributed, healthy market.
Do you think that is, I feel like we've been unevenly distributed for years. Do you think it's even more so now?
Well, 21 was a pretty good year all around.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe it's given some false hope. The other thing to many, both the independent publishers, independent ad tech, and TV network owners, I don't think there was an appreciation of just how much fluff was in the market at that time and how much unsustainable activity. But you can even look back to the 2010s, digital advertising grew and TV grew. Now, not such a great environment if you're a print-based publisher, if you're in the radio business, but in terms of the distribution of that growth, it actually was fairly broad. You go back 10 years ago and you remember far too many voices were incorrectly arguing for the death of TV, or they're saying, oh, it's over now. It's like, no, it really wasn't. There are lots of good reasons to believe that TV was pretty healthy and going to stay healthy for a little while longer, at least, even if the underlying basis to those projections weren't wrong in the very, very long term. But no, I think in the 2010s, you had a lot of growth all around.
I want to go back to what you said about spend coming in from countries outside the United States. And I'm assuming that, and when you mentioned China, I'm assuming that you're primarily talking about, or two good examples are Temu and Shein, if that's correct, right?
Yeah, among others, but critically, among many, 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 many others.
Okay. So what concerns me a little bit about that, and maybe I'm a little too paranoid, or maybe I'm a little too conservative, but what concerns me a little bit about that is the fact that China is not a country that we have the best diplomatic relations with right now, particularly in terms of trade. Now, if former President Donald Trump wins the election next year and becomes our president in what would be 2025, I would think that those would decrease even more. Do you think that could have a negative effect on the spend of those companies in our advertising ecosystem in the US, and thus, because they are taking a higher chunk or a significant chunk out of, in terms of contribution to ad spend in the US, that then could have a negative effect on advertising spend in the US down the road?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd say that in general, unfortunately, protectionist trade policies have a home in both parties.
Yep.
So I think the main difference that you would see is that any evolution of this would be way more transactional than political or philosophical. If it were, say, Trump versus Biden win in 24. But I do agree that there's a risk to be mindful of that. Go back again 5 to 10 years ago when I was an analyst covering companies, including Facebook, and it was pretty evident that they were generating a ton of revenue from Chinese-based manufacturers. And again, to be clear, way beyond just Temu and Shein. And it was already in the billions of dollars in 2016, 2017. I kept trying to raise the point when I'd write about it or ask them, like, okay, there is a risk to trade, not just trade policy, but more critically, postal reform. Right, it's cheaper to send a good from Shenzhen to San Diego than it is from Los Angeles to San Diego, depending on the product, because of this, is it 1880s or 1890s era global postal regulation that exists.
Right.
And the reality is that was at risk of being changed in the last go around. Now, you could argue maybe that should be. Let's separate the shoulds from wills from whatever. But the point is, objectively, if you're not aware of this source of activity and you're trying to analyze these companies or understand the state of the market, and you're not aware of the fact that there is money that's benefiting from these rules effectively, then that's a risk that everyone should be more aware of. And I think you're right. Then because trade policy is leaning protectionist, regardless of party, that there is a pretty it's a risk to be mindful of in terms of a downside potential from a growth for the advertising market as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you said that, because I brought that up because I think that sometimes in our industry we look at things at face value a little too much, and we're not concerned about potential cracks that are there.
Yep.
So when I see this, it set off a couple of alarms in my head, and I just feel that as an IAB and someone as like yourself, who people turn to for advice and guidance, that these are good things to make people aware. And of course, you did that in your blog. Is the blog called the Madison and Wall?
Well, madisonandwall.substack.com, formerly, as of prior to January 1, free, but now available to either advisory clients, consultant clients, or on a corporate subscription basis.
Great. I wanted to make sure that we plugged the newsletter. I read it all the time. It's very informative. One of the key reasons why I wanted to invite you today, I was like, this guy's thinking about some pretty cool stuff that I really want to bring to the forefront. I want to move along a little bit, and I want to talk about advertising categories for 2024. I see the growth projections for a majority of the industries. Many of them are single digits. I think obviously the elections and the Olympics will help. I feel like I'm not seeing anything interesting going on. And I'm going to get to that in 1 second, right? So we have travel and tech and telecom and pharma look very promising, high single digits. And auto is also returning. We saw a stronger second half. CPG, personal care is kind of flattish. So my question for you is, what's interesting there in terms of if you're a media seller, if you're a content owner, I'm not talking about the big platforms. I'm talking about if you're like many of the IB members, the publishers, and that would include like the broadcasters who have linear and they have streaming. And then you have, the CNN.coms of the world and the ESPNs and even all the way down to the Atlantic and the New Yorkers that have .coms and that they're trying to sell open web impressions. What are the categories that these companies should be going to?
Yeah, well, I'd say the categories are always very tricky to define, frankly,
Yeah.
let alone anticipate in terms of growth rates, just because, the categories themselves evolve. And so it's rare that I would make meaningful generalizations. But the two that I would make, at least, include, or maybe three or four. First of all, the whole notion of the year of efficiency, or as I wrote sometime last year, or years of efficiency, is a real thing that's going to continue to impact technology-centric companies. So that paradoxically, or ironically, I'm not sure which the right word is, companies that are the primary beneficiaries of all this growth in advertising revenue are also cutting their spending or keeping their spending at a very low level. Arguably proving that the correlations between what you spend on advertising and what you generate in revenue, whatever your source of revenue, may not always be so correlated. And so I think it's safe to say that if you're dependent on that vertical, now hopefully the reset has happened. But you could point to what happened to packaged goods in the 2010s in the era of 3G acquiring as many packaged goods companies as they could and zero-based budgeting becoming the norm for a lot of companies in that category. Took a little while for that to play through, and like several years of really, really rough times for anyone dependent on packaged goods. So you never know how long this could take for that vertical. Back to packaged goods, they have largely gotten religion again with respect to advertising in the wake of Kraft Heinz blowing up in 2019, early 2019. I remember watching some investor presentations, and you could only conclude that the whole category felt liberated, like ding dong, the witch is dead. This whole ZBB thing is a bad idea. Let's go back to like running our businesses like they're businesses. And you certainly have seen a lot of ongoing growth from the category in general. And it's been helped by the fact that retail media has become such a huge space. And now you could argue that if the packaged goods advertisers are increasing their spending by, let's say, high single digits or low double digits year over year, but it's all going to anyone who's playing in retail media, it's hard to say that others are going to get to benefit from that as much unless you've got a working relationship with the retail media companies. So that's something to keep in mind. You can point to some other just general observations in other categories. One thing that I recently wrote about because it stood out so much, I've argued forever that creative destruction is the right concept to think about how the advertising economy evolves. No, I'm not talking about the end of J. Walter Thompson or Ogilvy and Mather. I'm talking about the Joseph Schumpeter concept that businesses evolve and others come into an economy to replace those which came before. That's a very natural process. And when you apply this concept to advertising, and you think about an advertiser who emerged in the year 1990 They're different than one that emerged in the year 2000, different than one that emerged in the year 2010, and similarly different than one that emerged in the year 2020. So what's really interesting is you look at, well, some advertisers that emerged far, far before then, the autos. And I was just looking at where they ranked among the largest advertisers in 90, 2000, 2010, and
I
2020.
saw that. Yep.
They fell off a cliff,
Yep.
meaning it's not that they cut their spending so much as they stayed the same while all sorts of new advertisers came in their place. And that's kind of a big deal because it just highlights that if you kept selling to the auto manufacturers and you were dependent on them, you wouldn't have grown at all over a decade.
Didn't Amazon trump P&G as the largest spender in the US in
Yep.
the past year?
Yeah, and that by far they are globally as well. But the point is that new categories emerge all the time, right? And now
Yeah.
we don't even know. I mean, again, it's a lot of this is involves making estimates. We have no idea how big Pinduoduo is, PDD, which owns
Yep.
Temu, is, right?
Yep.
They disclose sales and marketing. I mean, I don't think there's any way they could be bigger than Amazon as a buyer of advertising. But in the US, they're unquestionably spending in the billions.
Yeah.
And that would probably put them up at the very top or near the very top.
And really affecting the ad prices, which concerns me a little bit with the smaller direct consumer brands or people starting new businesses.
People pay too much attention to prices. I mean, this is an important thing because
Tell me.
if I learned one thing, when I replaced a guy named Bob Cohen when I was at Interpublic, he
Yeah.
started in the late 1940s. I remember seeing a series of slides, acetates really, about pricing in television in the 1950s, and it was showing like these year-over-year increases, like of 100%. And I said, "Oh my God, Bob, how on earth, in a low inflation environment, did advertisers manage TV campaigns when their prices were doubling year over year?" And he said, "Oh, it's simple. We invented the flight." Right? This
Yeah.
is the point, that more thoughtful buying,
Yes.
different approaches to targeting can crush higher prices for like inventory. And I don't think enough people pay attention to that. If you're looking at it from the vantage point of an investor or a seller, like a manager of sellers, the revenue is the revenue. Pricing is an output, not an input. This is a big mistake that a lot of people make. Pricing is a consequence of the dynamics of a negotiation at a given point in time, the way the market works for negotiations. But revenue is different. The budgets are relatively fixed and independent of price for the vast majority of advertisers. So it's up to the thoughtfulness of the marketer and the agency, certainly, and sometimes in partnership with the seller, to figure out, well, here's your budget. What's the best way you can manage this budget? Are there different ways of thinking about how to use the budget that would make you equally well as off, even if on a like-for-like basis? Sure, you experience 100% price increases, but it's possible you could actually be more efficient despite that.
So is an example of that the launch of Google's Performance Max and Meta's Advantage Plus and shopping? Those two tools seem to be really successful, have helped those companies have a pretty good year. Is that an example of the type of tool that can talk about the
It can be. I mean, now again, it depends. If the products have objectives that are consistent with the marketer's objectives, and it creates indifference, if you will, about what inventory exactly you're buying, and you're okay with that indifference, then yes, it absolutely is. But I think the qualification has to be that the marketer has to get okay with that indifference. If they're not okay with that indifference, then they need to come up with a different approach.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing, I didn't think about it. I didn't think about those tools that way at first. And just you mentioned it now. Now I'm thinking about that. What I wanted to talk about when I was thinking of them was the sunsetting of cookies, which third-party cookies, which is going to happen at 100% rate this time, in Q4 of 2024. And I'm wondering if those two tools are an example of what automated targeting and performance measurement will look like in the post-cookie ecosystem.
Definitely an example. I mean, at the end of the day, cookies were always just a signal. I think that by now most people are in on the joke that cookies weren't ever that good.
Oh, I agree. I'm a big believer in that.
Right. But to the extent that the reason why there's a problem, anyone has a problem with the change, is it's a change. It requires new and unpredictable workflows.
Yep.
At least how you're managing your workflows in a world where you just keep using cookies. My guess is it's going to play out an awful lot like what we saw with GDPR, just without a singular big bang.
Hmm.
And again, going into GDPR, it seemed very, very clear from the outside that it's not going to change total spending trends. Budgets are independent of the availability of data for the vast majority of marketers. However, who has the relatively better data or the least bad data, ceteris paribus, as the economics kids like to say, wins.
Oh, wait, I'm going to challenge you there for a second. Spending is independent of the availability of data.
Yep.
Some would say that the rise of CTV and streaming of CTV is not just because consumers are migrating from linear television to CTV and streaming. It is also because that CTV provides a level of data and targeting that linear TV never provided.
If I were standing up, I'd be shouting and jumping and saying, you know what I'd be saying? Show me the money.
Okay.
Show me where the money is. And I think this is the bigger point. Like, it's impossible to identify where that increment is in any meaningful way beyond the randomness of any new category emerging, and it often does. TV
Yeah.
advertising is in decline, right? Independent of it. The vast majority of connected TV is viewed through the lens of marketers as a part of television broadly and
Right.
budgeted accordingly.
Very true.
And they happen to have a share of gross rating points that probably will map to the share of budgets.
Right. Absolutely. You had talked about, I'm starting to think about um, solutions for 2024. We got into the weeds a little bit in terms of strategies and how to spend and how to automate it and how to do it effectively and pricing. One of the things that we saw in our report year over year is that focusing as a solution on cross-platform measurement, leveraging first-party data, and attribution modeling, those three things increased by 20 percentage points year over year in terms of things that the buyers of brands and agencies will focus on. I hope that this suggests that the industry will work hard in 2024 to get that third-party cookie monkey off their back. Um, do you think those three things as a focus play a role in that? Do you potentially think that they're just blowing smoke, that they're saying,
No, they're going to have to do something. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah,
I think that there's too much momentum for Google not to do it this time.
yeah,
And I think that, um, certainly the availability of so much other data out there, whether it's marketers building their first party data sets, retailers making their data sets available for targeting, et cetera, means that there are alternative data out there. And I
yeah.
think that there's different paradigms for targeting that are evolving, and everyone's looking at different approaches. And I do feel that there will be change. It's just the hard thing to anticipate from the outside, and I'm sure it's even harder on the inside of a company, a seller of advertising, is who ultimately benefits. Who, like, how do the shares shift? Again, the maximum that I've seen work is whoever's the least bad data wins. And so you would expect, like, we already see this trend favoring the largest platforms. For every marketer who's out there talking about how important journalism is, how important news is, earnestly speaking to how much they care about what it means for democracy, they're still spending more and more money with platforms and away from journalistically oriented sources, which, by the way, as an aside, means, yeah, journalistic entities, you really need to focus on subscriptions, because I don't know if advertisers are going to save you. So the point is that where that data lives at scale is on the platforms, and they probably are going to benefit with whatever combination of targeting tactics are involved.
Am I naive to think, to be hopeful in the fact that I saw that up in Canada, that Google is now, I forget how that legislation or that lawsuit played out. I think it was either dropped or the ban wasn't going to happen. However, Google did agree to pay a significant amount of money to journalism in Canada, to publishers of journalism in Canada. Are you aware of that
Oh
development?
yeah, as a Canadian, certainly, and Australia kind of set the template.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I don't think it makes a big difference, frankly. I
Uh,
mean,
all right.
if you're if you are a publisher, are you relatively better off for a deal such as this? Probably. But I keep observing, and this is more of a general point, that publishers have aimed to keep the profit margins of their businesses as close to where they were before the internet existed without making any meaningful investments or not sufficient investments.
Hmm.
And I think that we have a separate problem where so much of the industry scale requires global focus. So if you're an Australia focused publisher or a Canada focused publisher, and you're really just trying to compete in your own country, in your own neighborhood, I think that's a losing long-term proposition, unfortunately. As an example, I mean, it's obviously not crossing borders. I live in Oregon. I would say the best reporting that I read is usually in the New York Times about Portland, Oregon, or the Wall Street Journal, even. Like occasionally there is some journalism from local sources here. It's usually, ironically, the best stuff usually comes from the independent alt weeklies. But I think that the problem is that the legacy publishers of newspapers typically are trying to focus on maintaining profit margins as much as possible. If they can, for lack of a better word, if they can find money in a way they can, whether through regulation or other means, they will. But I don't think that doesn't create really healthy conditions, I don't think, because it really deters or limits the incentives to find ways to grow more, shall we say, organically.
What do you think the lowest hanging fruit is in terms of growing organically?
Subscriptions,
Yeah.
creating a product that people want to pay for. And I think that now, again, if there was a better approach, it'd be interesting to see if it was ever considered and how to test it. But the idea of create a subsidy program for consumers, where basically a government says, "All right, consumers, everyone gets $100 credit to pay on for these publishers." I think some countries have tried something like this.
Hmm.
I'd frankly be interested to see what the consequences have been. And yeah, it does mean you could end up with individuals, funding some undesirable publishers, or government
Yeah.
has to get in the business of choosing who's desirable, who's not. And that's a
Yeah.
whole other ball of wax of a
Yes, it
problem.
is. Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting. We're at a point right now in the industry, obviously, where we are maturing or have matured. So growth is going to slow. It's going to continue to be slow. It's not going to be like it was 10, 15 years ago. Um, and
Well, when you are the industry, you can't really expect to grow much faster than the industry.
Absolutely. So, I thought it was interesting. The lead economist for the IAB in Europe presented to us recently, and he mentioned that in order for us to continue to evolve and to kind of get over this kind of anemic growth that could happen as you mature is more ad innovation. I'm curious. To me, that's a very vague term, and I'm sure he meant a couple specific things. Um, I tend to be a little bit more skeptical about ad innovation when it really just needs to be clear, above the fold, make sense, blend with the content, be well targeted, and make the consumer happy. What do you think about in terms of what type of ad innovations could really make this industry a lot more exciting for brands?
Yeah. Well, first, Daniel Knapp, I think, does great work for your colleagues over there. But I think that the only innovations that really matter in terms of now there's innovations that can just get people excited and want to wake up and do their jobs.
Yeah,
But the money is still going to flow for the most part.
yeah,
What causes new money to flow really requires a product innovation that catalyzes new categories of advertisers to spend. A great example, back to the Chinese or offshore advertising example, the physical act of setting up shop in China or Vietnam and developing legions of small and medium-sized businesses in those markets to orient their businesses around export opportunities, making them educated about helping to educate them about how it all actually works. Maybe you start with loans as part of the process, right? You foster these environments. That's innovation, right?
Interesting.
And that is the sort of thing that's why one of the main reasons why the advertising market has grown much faster than otherwise would have. Chinese in particular, and Vietnamese to a second degree, but Chinese ad spending into the United States is probably adding a couple percentage points to growth rates.
Yeah, that's what you were saying. I read that and I was
right.
That's where my
So
concern.
you want to see meaningful different, and again, Meta and Amazon are probably the primary beneficiaries because I don't think any others have set up the same scale.
TikTok.
I mean, they're obviously in market, but I'm just saying, like, they're smaller. They're small even by comparison to Meta and Amazon for these purposes.
Of course. Yep.
So I think that finding ways to bring new segments of advertisers who weren't otherwise advertising, and I think too often you hear about a platform saying, "Oh, we're just going to go after SMBs, and that's where the growth is." Okay, first of all, no. Spending by SMBs and large businesses has basically been about the same pace of growth from every piece of data I've found. Second, most platforms trying to sell to SMBs in the domestic sense, they only have one or two platforms they're going to spend money with. It's got to be way more nuanced strategy than just saying we're going after SMBs. It's like, why are you one of the only two places someone with a $10,000 budget is going to spend?
Right.
It's not going to be efficient if it's, if you're trying to just get a small peak, like a $500 of a $10,000 budget. Not going to happen. Too much time and effort. But finding ways to be a must-buy property for an underexploited, for lack of a better word, segment, or an underdeveloped segment of the advertising market, that's ad innovation that drives incremental growth.
Got it. Interesting. We only have a couple more minutes. I want to talk lastly about the two channels. Again, I'm going to come back to CTV, but retail media and CTV. Bright futures, projections are strong, fastest growing channels in media, double-digit growth projected. I know a lot about both spaces. I've done studies on both this year, really looked under the hood of the buy and sell side, and in the intermediaries in the middle that help power those two channels. But what I really want to understand there is what's potential, are there nuggets of strategies or tactics that are happening there that portends to healthy growth for years to come, potentially, or that other channels can learn from? It's got to be more than just consumers adopting streaming, i.e. CTV, and closed loop reporting, i.e. retail media. Right? I mean, is it the retail media networks partnering with NBCU and Walmart and The Trade Desk to do cross-platform targeting for more rich campaigns? What is it? Because I feel like in any kernel of growth in this industry, there's an aspect of a lesson that can be learned across the industry. And I'm trying to figure out beyond the obvious things what it is with retail.
Oh, I have it.
Tell me.
Well, no, it's actually, I would argue, the most important factors to start with. First, when it comes to CTV, if you double your share of the spending on content for a given content-based medium, and everyone else holds stable, you'll basically double your share.
Okay.
It's really that simple. And I think it's the most important factor driving CTV growth. It's the reality is that if there's available GRPs, gross rating points, they're driven by investment in programming in that environment. If you or I, Chris, I'm sure you're enjoying your time at the IAB, but let's just say you and I went to go walk down, I don't know, whatever street you're on right now. Eventually, we'd run into a billionaire. We'd say, "Hey, billionaire, can I have $1 billion, please?" And say, "What for?" We say, "No, we'll tell you later." We go and spend that money on. We go find someone else down the street. Say, "Hey, person, can I turn you into the newest, I don't know, celebrity?" And then we say, "Great, how much? We'll pay you $1 billion for everything." Okay, maybe we need a little bit more for operation costs. Roughly speaking, once we cut a couple of distribution deals, would have about 1.5% viewing share. I could say plus or minus 0.5%. Right? Do that again, times 5. Now you've got yourself a decent sized video property. It could all be connected TV or not. Doesn't really matter, because there's a relationship between the value of programming and the propensity of consumers to watch it. It's really that simple, I think. Every data point, every time I try to analyze this, I find this conclusion to be true. So that's the first thing. On the retail media side, the best way to build a business is create a situation where your customer can't possibly walk away. I'm not saying shakedown, but I think that the thing is that retail media can get its start, or anyone else could get their start as retail media did to some degree, by saying, well, if you don't spend, I don't know, maybe someone else might accidentally end up borrowing your keywords. Be a shame if that happened. I mean, that's the sort of that would be a good way to do it digitally. And physically, it's like, boy, you sure do like having your products for glasses at eye level, right? Yeah, I don't know. We're thinking ankles might be where the glasses are going to go.
Right.
You're okay with that, glassware maker, right?
Right.
Oh, wait, we have an idea about how you might get around that. I got some inventory for you. So I think that that's usually the best way to start. And certainly anecdotally, I mean, retail media networks are vastly improved in terms of their capacity to demonstrate results. And they do play in to this focus on performance and objectives, independent of whether or not their attribution models are correct. That doesn't even matter.
Right.
They're credibly selling performance, and let's hope that they are. A thing that I hope a lot of marketers learned, from the era of Facebook's growth, was that Facebook was incredibly good at getting the customer who's already most likely to buy your product in the first place.
Right.
And I don't know that those sorts of controls are properly always in place, but maybe it doesn't matter. I think that, again, the foot in the door is the make yourself absolutely necessary. And then if you want to keep your budget and grow it to where it's much more meaningful, it probably is necessary to actually find ways to add value to that customer.
Yeah, one of the things that we found in our research regarding retail media is that on the buy side, the brands and the agencies obviously want a lot more transparency about where their dollars are going and how specifically is performing. Incrementality is a huge thing. Would this person buy this product anyway without my advertising is a huge thing. And they're saying, well, we're not going to increase our spending with the retail media network, at double-digit growth year over year until we get more of these signals. I think that they say that, and that is true. And the retail media networks do recognize that and are working to share more signals. At the same time, when you ask brands, why they spend there, our research showed that down at the bottom was that they have to, because of their, because they're sold in store, because they're endemic brands. And the top responses, there are 5 or 7 responses above that to talk about the data that we get. It performs well, it's closed loop, it's ROI, its ability to find incremental audiences. So as imperfect as it may seem in terms of what the buy side
I'm not disagreeing with that.
They love it. They love it.
Well, I hear more mixed views, I'd say. I think that there are some who do, but I think there are many others who see it as a bit of a tax.
It absolutely is a tax.
Yeah. That doesn't mean that if you're selling the advertising, it doesn't mean that you can't continue to work towards a better product, which they are universally.
And that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
Brian, we are short on time. It was amazing to have you today. I thank you very much. I want to stay in touch this year, and we will continue to do this. I think it's going to be a fascinating year. Hopefully it does not get too crazy with the election, and that we stay calm and safe and amicable to each other. I mean, to each other, I'm talking about the country writ large. But I think, this industry is incredibly interesting. It's moving quickly. And I think it's a lot more positive than negative, and that's something we need to reflect on a daily basis. I want to thank you, sir, for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
I hope that you will come back. And lastly, I want to say thank you to our viewers and listeners. It is IAB Pulse. This is a IAB Pulse Let's Chat, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you very much.